Cotubanama emerged as one of the final great leaders of Taino resistance in the Caribbean at a moment when Spanish conquest had already devastated much of the indigenous world of Hispaniola. By the time his name entered Spanish records, the island had been transformed by violence, disease, forced labor, and betrayal. Entire chiefdoms had collapsed. Populations had been reduced catastrophically. Spanish authorities believed resistance was finished. Cotubanama would prove them wrong. He did not rise at first contact, nor did he fight in the opening chaos of invasion. He rose in the aftermath, when survival itself had become an act of defiance. The Taino world, before Spanish arrival, was organized around regional chiefdoms governed by hereditary leaders who balanced political authority, spiritual responsibility, and communal welfare. Hispaniola was densely populated, agriculturally productive, and deeply interconnected through trade and kinship networks. Early Taino leaders attempted diplomacy, hospitality, and coexistence, believing the newcomers were temporary. Those efforts were met with enslavement, tribute demands, executions, and terror. By the time Cotubanama emerged as a regional leader in the eastern part of the island, the illusion of peaceful coexistence had been shattered completely. Cotubanama ruled in a landscape scarred by trauma. Spanish encomiendas had forced Taino people into brutal labor regimes. Families were separated. Communities were relocated or destroyed. Disease swept through populations already weakened by violence and starvation. Earlier leaders who had attempted diplomacy were captured, humiliated, or executed. Cotubanama learned from these failures. He understood that Spanish authority was built not only on weapons, but on fear and fragmentation. His resistance would target both. Unlike earlier Taino leaders who confronted the Spanish through limited uprisings, Cotubanama organized sustained, coordinated warfare. He rallied surviving Taino communities who had fled into forests, mountains, and coastal regions. These were not isolated bands. They were remnants of a people who still remembered autonomy. Cotubanama transformed that memory into action. He organized attacks on Spanish settlements, ambushed patrols, and disrupted communication routes. Spanish settlers who believed the eastern regions were pacified found themselves under constant threat. The terrain of eastern Hispaniola became central to Cotubanama's strategy. Dense forests, river valleys, and coastal inlets limited Spanish mobility and made cavalry less effective. Taino warriors moved quietly, striking quickly and withdrawing before Spanish forces could respond. These were not symbolic attacks. They inflicted real losses and forced the Spanish to divert troops and resources to suppress resistance they believed had already been crushed. Cotubanama turned survival into strategy, using mobility and local knowledge to offset Spanish firepower. Spanish authorities responded with escalating brutality. They launched punitive expeditions designed to terrorize Taino communities into submission. Villages were burned, captives were executed publicly. Dogs were used as weapons. Cotubanama refused to surrender. Each act of Spanish violence only reinforced his conviction that resistance was the only path left. His leadership attracted more survivors, including those who had lost families, land, and status under colonial rule. What began as resistance became a final stand for dignity. Cotubanama's uprising represented one of the last organized indigenous military efforts on Hispaniola. Spanish chroniclers described it as stubborn and dangerous, precisely because it emerged when conquest was supposed to be complete. His resistance disrupted the narrative of inevitability that Spanish officials relied on to maintain control. If resistance could reappear after such devastation, then conquest was never truly secure. Eventually, Spanish forces intensified their pursuit of Cotubanama himself. They understood that his leadership was holding the movement together through betrayal, exhaustion, and overwhelming force. Cotubanama was captured. His arrest was treated as a major victory. Spanish authorities staged his execution as a warning, believing that killing the last major Taino leader would finally extinguish resistance on the island. Cotubanama was executed publicly, reportedly by hanging, a deliberate act meant to degrade and erase his authority. The Spanish believed that with his death, Taino resistance would end permanently. In one sense, they were right. There would be no more large-scale indigenous uprisings on Hispaniola. But in another sense, they failed. Cotubanama's resistance did not disappear. It transformed into memory, identity, and survival in hidden forms. The Taino people were not erased. They were absorbed, dispersed, and forced into invisibility. But they endured through intermarriage, cultural transmission, and oral history. Cotubanama became a symbol of the moment when the Taino refused to vanish quietly. His leadership represents the transition from open warfare to cultural survival, from visible resistance to persistence beneath colonial rule. Cotubanama's story forces us to confront the true cost of conquest. He did not fight from a position of strength. He fought from a position of loss. His resistance was not about reclaiming an empire, but about refusing complete annihilation. He fought knowing the odds, knowing the likely outcome, and choosing defiance anyway. That choice matters. In the broader history of the Americas, Cotubanama stands among the final indigenous leaders who confronted European empire directly in the Caribbean. His execution marks not the end of Taino existence, but the end of Spanish tolerance for indigenous autonomy on the island. From that point forward, resistance would survive in quieter forms, but it would never disappear entirely. Cotubanama's legacy challenges the idea that resistance must succeed militarily to matter. His resistance mattered because it disrupted conquest, forced the Spanish to expend violence and resources, and preserved a memory of defiance that survives centuries later. He represents the final chapter of armed Taino resistance and the beginning of cultural endurance under impossible conditions. Cotubanama did not win, but he refused to surrender his people's dignity. In a world determined to erase them, that refusal became its own form of victory. Follow for more history they never taught us in school.